People die on board. It's an unavoidable fact of air travel. Something we all wish never happened, but sadly, it does. Roughly one passenger dies for every 53,000 flights that take to the skies, and the majority of those deaths can usually be traced back to the determined traveller, the passenger who isn't quite feeling right. The person who knows deep down they probably shouldn't be flying, but they convince themselves that it'll be okay. The traveller desperate for one final holiday, one final family visit, one important journey they simply have to make. And sometimes they make the wrong gamble. But not everybody who dies on an aircraft is visibly unwell. Some people wake up that morning excited for their trip. They eat breakfast. They joke in the airport queue. They board the aircraft with absolutely no idea that somewhere inside their body something is waiting to fail, and that it will do so when they are high above the clouds. And when that happens, we as crew will do everything we possibly can to save them. We'll fight for them at 37,000 feet with everything we have, because we don't want to lose them. They are our responsibility when they are up there with us, and we want them to reach where they're going. They aren't just a number. They are a person that we genuinely care about. But today's story isn't really about the person who dies. It's about the people around them. Because when somebody passes away on a flight, there's nowhere to hide it. We don't have hospital curtains to pull around. We don't have side rooms to wheel them into. Whatever happens usually unfolds right there in the cabin, in full view of the passengers sitting nearby. And that means some people never forget what they witnessed. So when we heard today's story, we genuinely couldn't believe it. Because this is the story of one passenger who, over the course of just 10 years, found himself sitting next to somebody who died on board not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. 3 times. And by our very rough maths, for an average traveller taking a handful of return flights a year, the odds of that happening are somewhere in the region of 1 in a few billion. Which means there's a very good chance that this man may genuinely be one of the unluckiest passengers in aviation history. And, sir, if you're listening, we sincerely hope that we never end up sat next to you on a flight. Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the red eye! Welcome aboard the Red Eye. Abu Dhabi to Washington. Clive stuffed his bag into the overhead locker and looked down at his economy seat with a sigh. He'd been living in Abu Dhabi for 6 months now, and not everything about the job was quite how it had been sold to him. Yes, there were perks. The tax-free salary was certainly one of them. He, his wife, and the children lived in a beautiful house on a gated compound alongside other expats and colleagues. The kids were thriving in private school, and they even had a maid who seemed to magically keep the entire household running, freeing them up for things far less mundane than housework and cooking. But as for the international business travel, well, that certainly hadn't lived up to what he'd been sold. He'd imagined business class as a minimum, premium economy at the very least. Instead, some penny-pinching demon in accounts had apparently decided that employees within their first year could survive perfectly well in economy. So here he was, boarding a 15-hour red-eye to Washington, in a seat that would allow approximately 1 inch of space between his knees and the magazine pocket in front of him. And that was only if the passenger ahead chose not to recline. Still, he consoled himself with one small victory. At least he had an aisle seat. Yes, he'd had to drag himself out of bed at some ungodly hour that morning. Yes, he'd arrived at the airport absurdly early just to be near to the front of the check-in queue and guarantee he didn't end up trapped in a middle seat. But once the meal service was over and the cabin lights dimmed, he'd at least be able to angle one knee into the aisle. Maybe stand up now and then to stretch his legs without having to climb over two sleeping strangers. In the window seat, a young guy already sat with a pillow wedged between his head and the glass. Headphones on, wearing the sort of enviable peace that suggested he could probably sleep through a hostage situation. Perhaps Clive would get there too, eventually. He lowered himself into his seat and let the boarding queue continue to shuffle past. The usual chaos filled the cabin air as passengers glanced from boarding passes to seat numbers overhead, trying to locate their temporary little patches of misery. Bags were shoved aggressively into lockers already too full. People climbed over one another apologetically. Somewhere nearby, a child was already crying with impressive commitment. A few moments later, Clive sensed somebody standing beside him. He looked up to find an elderly woman pointing at the empty middle seat. He stood automatically to let her pass, but she didn't move. Instead, she looked down at the wheelie bag beside her feet, and then up at the overhead locker. It took him only a second to realise what she wanted, and he didn't hesitate. She looked impossibly frail. Her shoulders jutted sharply beneath the thin material of her abaya, the skin on her face weathered by years of sun. She may only have been in her 60s or 70s perhaps, but looked more like 100. How could he refuse? Clive bent down and lifted the bag, immediately surprised by the weight of it. It felt heavier than she was. He shoved it into the locker with considerably more effort than he'd expected and gave her a polite smile. But still, she didn't move. Instead, she smiled back at him and then pointed first at his aisle seat and then at herself. Clive blinked. No. He knew instantly what she was asking, despite not a single word being exchanged. Absolutely not. He'd been raised to respect older people. Of course he had. He'd help with bags, offer assistance, do whatever was reasonable, but there was simply no way he was surviving a 15-hour overnight flight wedged into a middle seat. And besides, she was tiny. She'd cope far better than he would. He gave an awkward little shake of his head. Sorry, no. The woman pulled a wounded expression, her face collapsing theatrically with disappointment. Clive shook his head again, firmer this time. The sadness vanished almost immediately, replaced with unmistakable irritation as she muttered something under her breath in a language he didn't understand. Clinging tightly to the seat in front for support, she slowly lowered herself into the middle seat beside him. Clive felt heat rise in his face. Part guilt, part annoyance that she'd somehow managed to make him feel guilty in the first place. He sat back carefully, making himself as small as possible, trying not to invade her space, trying instead to disappear into the seat and mentally remove himself from the atmosphere now radiating beside him. Oh, it was going to be a very long night. It was dark outside now, the cabin lit only by the soft blue glow of seatback screens and the occasional reading light left on by stubborn insomniacs. Around him, most passengers had finally surrendered to sleep. Faint snores drifted through the cabin in uneven little waves. And Clive realised with growing irritation, from right beside him too. He tried to ignore it, turning the volume up on his movie, but it was an odd sound. Wet. Raspy somehow. Not quite a normal snore. And once he'd noticed it, he'd found it impossible to tune out. He glanced sideways, though in the darkness he could barely make out her face. Shifting deliberately in his seat, he nudged the armrest slightly, hoping the movement might disturb her enough to stop the noise. It didn't. The sound came again. And this time, Something about it made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Slowly, he turned more fully towards her. Her mouth hung slightly open. Her eyes appeared closed. What were they? He reached up and switched on his reading light. The yellow beam fell across her face, and Clive felt his stomach tighten. Her eyelids were only partly shut. Beneath them, her eyes had rolled almost completely backwards. And then came the sound again. Not a snore. A horrible, gurgling rasp from deep in her throat. Instinctively, he grabbed her arm and shook it lightly. There was no response. "Excuse me?" he whispered sharply. "Madam!" Nothing. He hit the call bell. Once. Twice. Then repeatedly, jabbing at it now as he looked frantically into the aisle, until finally a flight attendant appeared, walking towards him with a weary expression and a preemptive glass of water in his hand. "Yes, sir. How can I help?" Clive half stood, moving into the aisle so the crew member could see past him. I think there's something wrong with the lady." Everything changed instantly. The flight attendant's face sharpened with alarm. Another crew member appeared almost immediately, and then another. Cabin lights burst on overhead, flooding the aircraft in sudden brightness as sleeping passengers blinked awake in confusion. Within moments, the quiet cabin had transformed into a full medical emergency. Clive flattened himself awkwardly into the aisle as crew hurried past carrying oxygen bottles, emergency kits, and medical equipment. Trying desperately not to get in the way, he watched as they lifted the woman carefully from the seat and carried her towards the door a few rows ahead. And, though nobody had said it out loud, Clive already knew that she was gone. That the awful snoring sound had been the final breath struggling out of her body. From where he sat, he could only see the tops of heads gathered around her, hear clipped instructions and the coordinated urgency of people fighting to bring somebody back. And all the while, unbelievably, nearby passengers complained about the lights being turned on. Others pressed call bells asking for drinks, blankets, and updates. Humanity, Clive thought numbly, really was extraordinary sometimes. Eventually, with nowhere else to go, he lowered himself back into his seat. And even now, he kept his elbows tucked tightly to himself, instinctively leaving space beside him as though she was still there. A young flight attendant paused beside him and softened slightly when she saw his expression. "Can I get you a drink, sir? You look like you need one." Until that exact moment, Clive hadn't realised how badly he did. Yes, please. Whiskey. Maybe a double." Out of habit, he turned slightly towards the sleeping passenger by the window, about to offer him one too. But astonishingly, the young man hadn't woken up at all. Near the end of the flight, as Clive walked around the cabin to stretch his legs, he noticed a shape on the floor behind one of the cabin dividers near the galley. Blankets had been tucked carefully around it. It took him only a second to understand what he was looking at. And a cold shiver passed through him. But that was ridiculous, and he knew it. People died on planes. It was a sad reality of modern travel. And nothing except terrible, random bad luck had caused it to happen in the seat beside him. Two years later. Clive laughed as he said goodbye to Isaac at the boarding door, watching with a small amount of guilt as his unfortunate colleague continued down the aisle towards economy, while Clive tucked his own bag above his premium seat. It wasn't that the company had suddenly become generous. Far from it. But management had at least agreed employees could finally collect their own frequent flyer miles. And Clive had been travelling so relentlessly over the last couple of years that he'd very quickly earned enough points to drag himself slightly further toward the pointy end of the aircraft. And honestly, he needed it. He was turning 40 this year, and recovering from long-haul economy seats now seemed to take longer than the actual flight themselves. Besides, when he landed back in Abu Dhabi tomorrow, he had his wife's birthday gathering to survive. She'd invited half the compound over. Caterers had been booked. Cases of wine had already been delivered to the house, and somehow, despite him having spent 15 hours crossing continents, she would still fully expect him to arrive home charming, sociable, and functioning like a normal human being. So, yes, tonight he intended to sleep. He still couldn't justify first class. Not yet, anyway. But this? Yeah, this was more than acceptable. A proper reclining seat. Actual legroom. A blanket that didn't feel like tracing paper. And, best of all, only one neighbouring passenger instead of two. He smiled politely at the man already seated by the aisle. The passenger returned a small nod and stood up to let him in. "Cheers, mate," Clive said, sidestepping past him before lowering himself gratefully into the window seat. He glanced back towards the man beside him, wondering briefly whether conversation might be on offer. A couple of airport beers with Isaac had loosened his tongue slightly, and there was something about long-haul flights that occasionally encouraged strangers into temporary friendships. But the man gave absolutely nothing back. Instead, he simply closed his eyes, loosened the top button of his shirt, and let out the sort of long exhale that universally translated to, "Please do not involve me in conversation." And that was fine by Clive. Truthfully, he usually felt exactly the same way himself. And perhaps, he thought as he settled back into his seat, the man's sleepiness might even prove contagious. Because this increasingly middle-aged traveller desperately needed a few solid hours tonight. In fact, Clive suddenly remembered something and reached into his pocket. Of course! Isaac's little miracle cure. He pulled out the small tablet his colleague had slipped him at the gate, accompanied by the confident promise that it would guarantee the best sleep you've ever had on a plane. Clive smiled faintly to himself. At this point, he was willing to try almost anything. He placed the pill on his tongue, unscrewed the complimentary bottle of water waiting in the seat pocket, and swallowed it down. "Good night, New York," he thought, gazing out through the window at the scattered lights of the airport glowing against the darkness. A small smile crept across his face. He glanced once more at the man beside him, already motionless with his eyes closed, before settling deeper into his seat. Who wanted conversation anyway? The sun was spilling through the cabin windows by the time Clive finally woke. For a few blissful seconds, he had absolutely no idea where he was. Then came the faint smell of breakfast drifting through the cabin air, the soft clatter of trays somewhere nearby, and the gentle hum of engines beneath the door. And with sudden amazement, he realised something else too. He had just had the best sleep of his life on a plane. Clive smiled to himself, mentally thanking Isaac for whatever miracle tablet he had slipped him before boarding. He stretched carefully, feeling the stiffness crack through his shoulders and lower back. Then noticed the seat beside him was empty, and gratefully used the extra space to straighten his arms properly. A quick trip to the toilet later, he returned to find the neighbouring seat still vacant. Odd. The sky map showed they still had almost 2 hours remaining before arrival into Abu Dhabi. Just enough time for a film if he chose carefully. He scrolled lazily through the entertainment system, searching for something under 90 minutes long, when movement beside him caught his attention. Expecting to see the man returning from the bathroom, Clive turned. Instead, a young flight attendant was crouched in the footwell beside the empty seat, quietly removing items from the seat pocket. At first, he simply watched her curiously. Then she reached beneath the seat and pulled out a small hold-all bag, unzipping it and beginning to search through its contents. That definitely didn't seem right. Everything okay?" Clive asked. The crew member glanced up briefly. "I need to find his passport," she said. Clive frowned slightly and looked at the empty aisle. "Is he getting off early?" he joked weakly, nodding towards the window. The joke landed horribly flat, and she didn't as much as smile at it. There was an odd expression on her face now, a slight confusion. "I'm afraid the gentleman passed away," she said softly. Clive stared at her blankly. For a moment, it genuinely felt as though she'd skipped the middle section of a conversation. Sorry," he said. I've literally just woken up. I'm not sure what you're telling me." Now she looked openly confused. "You didn't hear anything?" Slowly, Clive shook his head. "The gentleman became unwell during the flight," she explained carefully. "I'm very sorry, but he passed away." "Did you know him?" Again, Clive shook his head. Speechless now, he simply watched as she stood, clutching the bag to her chest before quietly walking away down the aisle. He sat motionless for a long while, his brain struggling to catch up with the reality of what he'd just been told. While Clive had been heavily asleep, the man beside him had become ill and died. That was all Clive knew. And honestly, all he needed to know. What unsettled him most of all, though, was the creeping realization that this was now the second time somebody had died after sitting directly beside him on a flight. A flight attendant appeared beside his row, pushing the breakfast trolley, the soft clink of cups disturbing his thoughts. She had a weary look on her face, as if the night she had endured had been a far cry from his. "Would you like breakfast, sir?" she asked politely. Clive looked at the tray of eggs and fruit for a moment, before slowly shaking his head. Any chance of a double whiskey instead?" he asked. A few years later. Clive didn't even feel shocked. He probably should have been. He should have been horrified, traumatized, emotional. He should have been a lot of things. But he wasn't. Because what none of them realized was that he had already been through this twice before. The main difference this time was that, unlike on the previous 2 occasions, the passenger hadn't eventually been moved somewhere more private. This time, she was still sitting beside him after the event. And so, when the flight attendant crouched beside him and apologetically explained that, in this particular case, the deceased passenger would need to remain in the seat beside him for the remainder of the flight because there was simply nowhere else to move her, well, what exactly was he supposed to say to that? If there was nowhere else to put her, then there was nowhere else to put her. And besides, the woman's husband sat devastated in the window seat on the opposite side of her body-shaped form, quietly crying into his hands. And compared to him, Clive wasn't suffering at all. No, he wasn't going to make a scene about having to sit next to her lifeless body for the rest of the flight. And he certainly wasn't going to admit that this wasn't his first rodeo either. Because, privately, deep down, Clive had started to wonder if somehow this was his fault. It was ridiculous, obviously, completely irrational, but once a thought like that enters your head, it roots itself there. And if he was beginning to think it, then surely other people would do too if he told them. "I'm dreadfully sorry, sir," the flight attendant said again, quietly. Clive glanced sideways at the figure beside him, carefully covered from head to toe beneath layers of airline blankets, and then looked back at her. "Is there anything at all I can do for you?" she asked. But they had already explored every option. There were no spare seats on the aircraft. He'd already known that at the beginning when he tried to upgrade with miles, but not even in economy. Even the spare jump seats were occupied by staff travel passengers. There was nowhere for Clive to move to, and nowhere for the deceased passenger to be moved either. This was simply the situation now. And they were only halfway through the flight. The captain had already decided there would be no diversion because there was little point. They were already flying towards the woman's home country. No hospital could help her, and even her grieving husband hadn't pushed for an emergency landing. So what good would it do for Clive to add further stress to an already impossible situation? Slowly, he shook his head. "Just keep the whiskies coming," he said weakly. Then he settled back into his seat beside the dead woman and stared at the moving map glowing on the screen ahead, his mind circling one thought over and over as he sipped his whiskey. How exactly could he guarantee that from now on, he only ever flew first class? Because at this point, Clive was starting to think it might genuinely be safer for everyone else if nobody ever had to sit next to him again. The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylie Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.